Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that sounds simple, but turns out to be surprisingly uncomfortable for the people involved. What happened to defeated kings after they lost everything? Not the glorious victories, not the triumphant parades, not the giant statues they paid for themselves. We are talking about the opposite, the awkward morning after, the moment when a man who spent years insisting he ruled by divine right suddenly discovers that divine right has apparently left the chat. So dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe grab a blanket, and together we'll drift through centuries of royal disappointment, political embarrassment, unfortunate family drama, and the strange afterlives of kings who woke up one day and realized they were no longer kings, because history remembers the winners. But bedtime history is often about the losers, and some of those losers had truly remarkable exits. Our journey begins in a world where kings were not merely politicians. A king was supposed to be special. He was chosen by God. He sat at the center of the kingdom like the sun at the center of the solar system, or at least that was the official marketing campaign. Reality was often slightly different. A medieval king spent a surprising amount of time worrying about rebellious nobles, empty treasuries, inconvenient relatives, and whether somebody was secretly plotting against him during dinner, which, to be fair, somebody usually was. The strange thing about monarchy is that it creates the illusion of permanence. A king can spend decades sitting on a throne, his face appears on coins, his name fills official documents, people bow when he enters a room, entire cities celebrate his birthday, and yet all of that can disappear astonishingly fast, sometimes in a single afternoon. One lost battle, one successful rebellion, one invading army, one angry cousin with ambitions. And suddenly, the man who expected to die as a king is looking for somewhere to sleep. Let's float back to one of the most famous examples, King Harold II of England. Now, Harold's reign was not exactly long. In fact, describing it as brief is being generous. Harold became king in January of 1066. By October, he was dead. Not exactly a retirement plan, of course. Harold lost his kingdom to William the Conqueror at the Battle of Hastings. And while Harold himself did not live to experience defeat for very long, his family certainly did. This was one of the cruel realities of losing a kingdom. Defeat was rarely an individual experience. It spread outward like ripples in a pond. A king's wife, his children, his brothers, his supporters, everyone felt the consequences. Harold's family watched as William systematically replaced England's ruling elite. Land disappeared, power disappeared, influence disappeared. The entire political world shifted. Imagine losing your job. Now multiply that by an entire social class. That was conquest. And William was not interested in providing career counseling. Many defeated royal families fled abroad. This became one of the most common outcomes for fallen kings, exile. History is filled with former monarchs wandering around foreign courts looking for support. They became medieval versions of displaced celebrities, still famous, still recognizable, but no longer in charge. Sometimes they spent years trying to reclaim their thrones, sometimes decades, sometimes the rest of their lives. And occasionally they became extremely annoying guests. A foreign king might welcome an exiled ruler at first. After all, hosting a defeated monarch could be politically useful. But after 15 years of hearing stories about how things used to be back home, enthusiasm could fade rather quickly. One king who understood this experience very well was James II of England. James lost his throne during the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Now the name Glorious Revolution sounds pleasant, like a cheerful civic improvement project. In reality, it involved political chaos, military pressure, and a king suddenly realizing that many of his supporters were not quite as supportive as advertised. James fled England and ended up in France. King Louis XIV welcomed him, at least initially. Louis was one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. He lived in the enormous Palace of Versailles. Everything about Versailles was designed to communicate prestige, gold decorations, grand gardens, endless ceremonies. If confidence could be turned into architecture, Versailles would be the result. James spent years there as a king without a kingdom. Technically royal, practically powerless. It was a strange existence. He still behaved like a monarch. People still addressed him with royal titles. Yet his actual authority extended approximately nowhere. It was like being the CEO of a company that no longer existed. A very elegant company, but still non-existent. James never stopped hoping for restoration. Many defeated kings didn't. Hope became a lifestyle. Every rumor seemed promising. Every political crisis looked like an opportunity. Every foreign alliance appeared to offer salvation. Years passed this way, then decades. Eventually, hope itself became a habit. The throne remained just out of reach, and James died in exile, far from the kingdom he once ruled. His story was hardly unique. Again and again, history presents the same pattern. A king loses power, he escapes, he waits, he dreams, he never returns. Let's drift further south toward the fascinating world of medieval Spain. In the late Middle Ages, kingdoms rose and fell with impressive regularity. Rulers lost battles, dynasties collapsed, political fortunes shifted constantly. One particularly interesting example was Boabdil, the last ruler of Granada. Boabdil occupied one of the most difficult positions imaginable. He inherited a kingdom surrounded by powerful enemies, not ideal. Granada was the final Muslim kingdom in Iberia, and by the late 15th century, its survival prospects were not looking especially strong. Ferdinand and Isabella were steadily expanding their power. Pressure mounted, resources dwindled, political divisions multiplied. Eventually, Granada fell, and Boabdil surrendered. Now here's where things become unexpectedly melancholy. Legend claims that as Boabdil departed Granada, he stopped to look back at the city one final time. He began to cry. His mother supposedly remarked that he should not weep like a woman for what he failed to defend like a man, which is one of the harshest parental comments in recorded history, even by medieval standards. Imagine already losing your kingdom. Then receiving performance feedback from your mother. Not a great day, Boabdil went into exile, his reign ended, his kingdom vanished, and he spent the remainder of his life away from the place he once ruled. For defeated kings, exile often created a strange identity crisis. Who exactly were they now? Their entire lives had been organized around monarchy. Their education, their relationships, their daily routines, their expectations, everything pointed toward kingship. Then suddenly it was gone. And unlike modern careers, there was no obvious next step. Former king was not a recognized profession. There were no retirement seminars, no support groups, no helpful pamphlets, just uncertainty, and a great deal of reminiscing, unfortunately for everyone around them. Many defeated monarchs became trapped in nostalgia. The past appeared increasingly glorious, the present increasingly disappointing, the future increasingly uncertain, which, if we're being honest, is a fairly human reaction. The difference was that most people lose jobs. These men lost kingdoms, and kingdoms are considerably harder to replace. As the night settles in, and the unfortunate former kings continue wandering through history, let's gently continue our journey. We left off with a familiar pattern. A ruler loses a kingdom. A ruler enters exile. A ruler spends years imagining a triumphant return that almost never arrives. And if there is one thing history teaches us, it is that kings are remarkably optimistic about comebacks, even when absolutely nobody else is. Tonight we'll meet several rulers who discovered that life after the throne could be strange, uncomfortable, and occasionally absurd, because losing a kingdom was rarely the end of the story. In many cases, it was merely the beginning of a long and awkward epilogue. Let's drift northward toward Scandinavia. Toward a king who became famous for losing not just a battle, but practically an entire era. Charles XII of Sweden had once terrified Europe. In the early 18th century, Sweden was still a major power, which sounds surprising today. Most people think of Sweden and imagine furniture, instructions, and cinnamon buns. But during Charles's reign, Sweden possessed one of the most formidable military machines in Europe. Charles himself became legendary. He spent much of his life campaigning. Marching, fighting, invading, counterattacking, planning another campaign, and then planning one more campaign because apparently the previous campaigns were not enough. At first, things went well, very well. Victories accumulated, enemies retreated, Charles seemed unstoppable, which, historically speaking, is often the moment when trouble begins. Eventually, he decided to invade Russia. Many rulers have made this decision. Very few have enjoyed the results. Russia possesses a remarkable ability to make invading armies regret their life choices. The deeper an army advances, the worse things become. Distances grow longer, supplies disappear, winter arrives, and suddenly everyone begins reconsidering their career path. Charles learned this lesson at the Battle of Poltava in 1709. The Swedish army suffered a devastating defeat. The balance of power shifted, Sweden's dominance began collapsing, and Charles himself found refuge in the Ottoman Empire. Now imagine this situation. You are a king. You previously commanded one of Europe's greatest armies. Now you are living as a guest in a foreign empire. For years, Charles remained there far longer than expected. At first, his hosts welcomed him. Then gradually enthusiasm declined. The Ottomans eventually began wondering when exactly their royal guest planned to leave. Charles, meanwhile, remained stubbornly focused on returning to power. One gets the impression that he never truly accepted defeat. His kingdom still existed. His crown remained technically secure, but the glory was fading. The dream was slipping away, and Charles spent years chasing a version of the past that could no longer be recovered. Many defeated rulers faced the same problem. They were not fighting for a future, they were fighting for yesterday. And yesterday is notoriously difficult to conquer. Let's float forward a century into the world of Napoleon Bonaparte. Now technically Napoleon was an emperor rather than a king, but his story fits perfectly here, because nobody illustrates the strange afterlife of defeat quite like Napoleon. For years he seemed unstoppable. Europe trembled, armies marched, borders shifted, kings disappeared, new kingdoms appeared. The map of Europe resembled a drawing somebody kept erasing and redrawing. Then things began unraveling, slowly at first. Then very quickly, again we encounter Russia. And again Russia proves remarkably unfriendly to ambitious invaders. Napoleon's disastrous invasion in 1812 shattered much of his power. Defeats accumulated, allies vanished, enemies advanced. Eventually Paris fell, and Napoleon abdicated. Suddenly, Europe's most powerful ruler became a former ruler, which was awkward. Nobody quite knew what to do with him. The solution was surprisingly creative. They gave him an island, not a kingdom. An island, Elba, a small Mediterranean island. The idea was simple. Napoleon could live there peacefully, rule over tiny territory, and stop causing continental crises. In theory, this made sense. In practice, it involved giving Napoleon authority over an island while assuming he would simply relax. History suggests this was optimistic. Napoleon lasted less than a year. Then he escaped, because of course he did. One almost has to admire the consistency. Most exiled rulers dream of returning. Napoleon actually returned. He landed in France. Supporters rallied, troops joined him. And for a brief moment, history became deeply uncomfortable for everyone who thought the problem had been solved. This period became known as the 100 Days. Unfortunately for Napoleon, it ended at Waterloo, and this time his enemies decided a larger island might be necessary. Far larger, far more remote, far more difficult to escape. So Napoleon found himself on St. Helena, a lonely island in the South Atlantic, thousands of miles from Europe, thousands of miles from power, thousands of miles from almost everything. Here he spent the final years of his life, reflecting, writing, remembering, arguing, complaining, a surprising amount of complaining, which, to be fair, is understandable. He had gone from controlling much of Europe to discussing gardening arrangements on a remote island. That is a considerable career adjustment. Napoleon's story reveals something fascinating. Many defeated rulers became obsessed with their legacy. If they could no longer rule the future, they could at least influence how future generations remembered them. Memoirs appeared, letters multiplied, stories were carefully crafted, narratives emerged. Former kings often became historians of themselves, and naturally, they tended to present events in a favorable light. Human nature remains remarkably consistent. Let's drift eastward now, toward one of history's most unusual former monarchs, Puyi, the last emperor of China. Puyi's life almost feels fictional. He became emperor as a small child. Imagine being handed supreme authority before learning basic arithmetic. Not ideal preparation. Servants surrounded him. Ceremonies defined his existence. An enormous palace became his world. He grew up believing he occupied the center of reality. Then reality changed. The Qing dynasty collapsed. Revolution transformed China, and suddenly the emperor possessed a title but very little power. For a while he remained inside the Forbidden City, a ruler without a functioning empire, like a king trapped inside a museum dedicated to his former importance. Eventually even that arrangement ended. Puyi lost his remaining privileges, his remaining authority, his remaining illusions. Later he became ruler of the Japanese-controlled state of Manchukuo, but real power belonged elsewhere. Puyi occupied the throne, others made the decisions. History contains many such rulers, kings who technically ruled, and yet ruled nothing. After World War II, his situation changed once again. He became a prisoner, then eventually an ordinary citizen. An ordinary citizen, imagine the adjustment. One day people bow before you. The next day you're navigating daily life like everyone else. Puyi eventually worked ordinary jobs. He lived a relatively modest existence and spent years reflecting on his extraordinary journey, from emperor to citizen, from palace to everyday life, from absolute privilege to surprising normality. Very few monarchs experienced such a complete transformation. And perhaps that is why his story feels so strangely human, because beneath all the ceremony and grandeur, he eventually encountered the same reality faced by millions of ordinary people. Life continues, even after the crown disappears. And that may be one of history's most persistent lessons. Kingdoms fall, dynasties vanish, thrones become empty, but mornings continue arriving, people continue agging, and former kings must somehow learn how to live in a world that no longer revolves around them. For some, that adjustment proved impossible. For others, it became the beginning of a second life, a quieter life, a stranger life, and sometimes, perhaps, a more honest one. As we continue our slow journey through royal defeats, we'll soon meet kings who became monks, kings who became prisoners, kings who became wandering exiles, and kings who spent decades trying and failing to reclaim what they had lost. The night grows a little deeper now. The castles are quieter. The battlefields have long since emptied. The banners have stopped waving. And somewhere across the centuries, a surprising number of former kings are sitting in borrowed houses, distant palaces, monasteries, and exile courts, wondering how exactly everything went so wrong. For centuries, rulers were taught a very simple lesson. They were chosen by destiny. Some believed they were chosen by God. Others believed their family line made them special. A few simply assumed everyone else was less qualified. History, unfortunately, had other ideas. And tonight we continue exploring what happened when kings discovered that crowns were not nearly as permanent as they looked. Let's gently drift toward medieval Scotland, a land filled with rugged hills, endless rivalries, and an impressive number of people named Robert, James, or Alexander. Scottish history often resembles a family argument that somehow escalated into a national crisis. One ruler who learned this the hard way was John Balliol. Now poor John Balliol is one of history's forgotten kings, which is unfortunate, mostly because his life became a masterclass in royal disappointment. John became King of Scotland in 1292. At first glance this sounds like a major achievement, and technically it was. The problem was that England's King Edward, I believed Scotland should answer to him. Edward was not famous for subtlety. He was the sort of ruler who looked at neighboring kingdoms and thought, that should probably belong to me, and then acted accordingly. John soon discovered that his royal authority had serious limitations. Edward constantly interfered, demanded obedience, issued orders, made decisions, and generally treated Scotland's king like an employee who kept forgetting who signed the paychecks. Eventually, Scottish resistance grew, war followed. Things went badly, very badly. John was captured, humiliated, and stripped of power. At one point, according to historical accounts, royal insignia were literally torn from his clothing, not exactly a dignified exit. Imagine getting fired so thoroughly that somebody removes the company logo from your jacket. John spent years in captivity, years, not days, not months, years. This was another common fate for defeated rulers, prison, because keeping an ex-king alive was often safer than killing him. A dead king could become a martyr. A living king locked away somewhere became easier to manage, at least in theory. History contains many imprisoned monarchs. Some spent decades behind walls. Others never saw freedom again. Many became political bargaining chips, useful pieces on a diplomatic chessboard. And while kings enjoyed many privileges during their reigns, prison had a remarkable way of simplifying things. Titles mattered less, ceremonies disappeared. The throne became a memory. For someone raised to command armies and govern kingdoms, captivity could feel especially surreal. John eventually lived out his remaining years in France, far from Scotland, far from power, far from the crown he once wore. And history largely forgot him, which may be the saddest fate of all. Not defeat, not exile, not imprisonment, being forgotten. Let's float gently toward another royal disaster, because history never seems to run out of them. This time we'll visit Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, a place where political stability occasionally appeared, looked around nervously and left. The Byzantine Empire possessed an extraordinary talent for palace intrigue. Plots emerged constantly. Conspiracies multiplied. Relatives betrayed relatives. Generals betrayed emperors. Emperors betrayed generals. Sometimes everybody betrayed everybody. Keeping track could become exhausting. One former emperor who experienced this firsthand was Isaac II Angelos. Isaac became emperor in the late 12th century. Things initially looked promising, which, as we've learned, is often a warning sign. Soon enough, political troubles emerged. Military setbacks followed. Then family drama arrived. Because royal families have always been remarkably efficient at creating problems, Isaac's own brother overthrew him, his own brother. The family reunion must have been awkward. Isaac was imprisoned, blinded, and removed from power. Blinding was unfortunately a common Byzantine practice. The logic was simple. A physically impaired ruler might be considered unfit to govern. Byzantine politics occasionally resembled a workplace dispute handled by medieval supervillains. Years later, Isaac actually regained the throne. For a while, then lost it again. Then chaos continued. Then even more chaos arrived. Eventually, the empire suffered the Fourth Crusade, which turned into one of history's strangest military expeditions. Instead of fighting their intended enemies, crusaders ended up attacking Constantinople itself. A truly remarkable example of losing sight of the original assignment. Isaac died amidst the turmoil. His story perfectly illustrates a recurring historical reality. Sometimes kings regained power, but restoration rarely solved everything. The kingdom had changed, the ruler had changed, the circumstances had changed. Trying to restore the past often proved impossible. The old world existed only in memory, and memory has a habit of editing details. Let's drift forward again, this time to France, to a king whose downfall became one of history's most famous political collapses. Louis XVI. Now Louis is often remembered as the king who lost his head during the French Revolution, which is true. But before that happened, something equally fascinating occurred. He lost his kingdom gradually, piece by piece. At first, Louis remained king technically. The revolution limited his powers, then limited them again, then limited them some more. Eventually, he occupied a strange position, still wearing the crown, still carrying the title, yet increasingly powerless. Like a captain standing on a ship while everyone else controls the wheel. For a brief period, France experimented with constitutional monarchy. The king remained, the authority faded, and Louis struggled to understand the rapidly changing world around him. Many historians describe him as indecisive, a man overwhelmed by events, not cruel, not brilliant, simply overwhelmed, which may explain why he appears surprisingly human compared to some rulers. Louis spent much of his final years watching the foundations of his world crumble. The old system vanished. The assumptions that shaped his life disappeared. The rules changed faster than he could adapt. Countless former kings experienced similar moments, not necessarily revolutions, but transformations, the realization that the world they understood no longer existed. And that can be difficult for anyone, especially someone whose identity depends entirely upon ruling. Let's wander somewhere quieter now. Away from revolutions, away from battlefields, toward monasteries, because surprisingly enough, some defeated kings became monks. This solution had certain advantages. Monasteries offered safety, food, shelter, and perhaps most importantly, distance from politics. Some rulers voluntarily retired there, others were strongly encouraged, which is a polite historical phrase meaning they had little choice. One famous example was the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, again technically an emperor rather than a king. But his story is too fascinating to ignore. Charles ruled an enormous empire: Spain, parts of Italy, the Netherlands, territories in the Americas. The list seemed endless. His responsibilities were equally endless: wars, diplomacy, religion, administration, letters, meetings, more letters, probably even more meetings. Eventually, Charles grew exhausted. Understandably so, he abdicated, divided his territories, and retired to a monastery. Imagine spending decades managing one of the largest political systems on Earth, then deciding you'd rather spend your time in relative peace. That sounds almost modern. Charles spent his final years surrounded by books, prayers, gardens, and reflection. There is something oddly comforting about that image. A ruler stepping away from power voluntarily, not because he lost a battle, not because he was overthrown, simply because he was tired. History rarely allows kings such peaceful exits. Most monarchs remained attached to power until circumstances forced them away. Charles chose a different path, and perhaps that is why his retirement feels unusually graceful. As our sleepy journey continues, we begin noticing a pattern. Defeated kings rarely vanished immediately. Instead, they entered strange second lives, lives defined by exile, captivity, retirement, nostalgia, reflection, sometimes redemption, sometimes bitterness, and occasionally a surprising amount of gardening. Because when a man spends decades ruling a kingdom, discovering tomatoes can become an exciting new hobby. History is funny that way. The grand dramas eventually shrink into ordinary days. The crown disappears, the throne becomes distant, and life, somehow, keeps moving forward, even for kings. The candles are burning lower now. The palace corridors have grown quiet. The royal trumpets have stopped playing. And somewhere in the distance, another former king is staring out a window, wondering whether next year might finally be the year he gets his throne back. It almost never was, but that rarely stopped them from hopping. One of the strangest things about defeated monarchs is how many refuse to accept that the story was over. Most ordinary people eventually adapt to major life changes. A former baker becomes a shopkeeper. A retired soldier becomes a farmer. A merchant starts a new business. Life continues. Former kings often struggled with this concept. After all, what exactly is the career path after ruling a kingdom? There is no apprenticeship for former monarchs, no helpful handbook, no village notice board advertising positions for unemployed sovereigns. And so many spent years doing the only thing they knew, trying to become kings again. Let's gently drift into one of the longest-running examples, James Francis Edward Stuart, known to supporters as James III of England. Known to opponents as the Old Pretender, which is not the most flattering nickname in history. The word pretender sounds like someone showing up to a costume party and taking things too seriously. Yet for James, the matter was very real. He was the son of the exiled King James II, the king we met earlier, living at Versailles and dreaming of restoration. When James II died, his son inherited something unusual. Not a kingdom, not a treasury, not an army, just a claim. And for decades he carried it. James spent much of his life moving between European courts, seeking support, negotiating alliances, writing letters, planning returns, imagining victories. The actual throne remained frustratingly unavailable. Years turned into decades. Political situations changed. Generations passed, still he waited. There is something deeply sad about these royal claimants. Their entire lives became organized around a future that never arrived. Imagine preparing for a job for 60 years, then never receiving it. That was essentially James's experience, yet he never fully abandoned hope. Hope became part of his identity. Without it, who was he? A question many exiled monarchs quietly faced. Eventually, James died in Rome, still claiming a throne he had never occupied, still surrounded by loyal supporters, still existing in a strange space between king and non-king. History is full of such figures, people whose kingdoms existed mostly in memory and paperwork. Let's float gently toward Poland, a kingdom that produced one of history's most unexpectedly successful former kings. Stanislaw Leszczynski. Now Stanislaw lost the Polish throne not once but twice, which sounds exhausting. Imagine finally becoming king, losing the kingdom, getting it back, then losing it again. At some point one begins to suspect the universe is sending a message. But Stanislaw's story took an unusual turn. Instead of spending the rest of his life plotting revenge, he adapted, a surprisingly rare strategy among monarchs. Eventually, he became Duke of Lorraine, a wealthy territory in what is now France. There he focused on culture, education, public works, architecture, and generally being productive. Historians often remember him fondly, not because of his kingship, but because of what he accomplished afterward, which is fascinating. Some rulers became more successful after losing their kingdoms, not many, but enough to notice. Perhaps power itself had been distracting. Perhaps defeat forced them into roles better suited to their abilities. Or perhaps they simply discovered that life contained more possibilities than they had imagined. It is an encouraging thought, even if history usually prefers less encouraging outcomes. Let's drift toward Russia, a land where former rulers often faced particularly uncertain futures. One figure worth mentioning is Tsar Vasily IV. His reign occurred during Russia's time of troubles, a period whose name leaves very little room for interpretation. Things were troubled, extremely troubled. Political chaos spread everywhere, claimants emerged, wars erupted, foreign powers intervened, pretenders appeared, then more pretenders appeared. At times it felt as though half the population was claiming to be somebody else. Vasily eventually lost support, lost power, lost freedom, and ultimately ended up as a prisoner in Poland. Imagine being the ruler of Russia, then finding yourself imprisoned in a foreign country. That is quite a career downturn, yet it happened repeatedly throughout history. Kings often assumed their position made them secure. The reality was considerably less stable. The higher the throne, the further the fall, and monarchs occupied very high places indeed. As we continue wandering through these royal afterlives, another pattern emerges. Many defeated rulers became symbols, sometimes willingly, sometimes not. Supporters projected hopes onto them, enemies projected fears. Political movements rallied around their names. A former king could become more useful as an idea than as an actual ruler. This happened again and again, especially during periods of unrest. A kingdom facing uncertainty might suddenly remember its exiled monarch. Nostalgia is a powerful force. People often imagine the past was simpler, safer, better, even when it absolutely was not. Former kings benefited from this tendency. Distance softened memories, failures faded, successes grew larger. Soon enough, the fallen ruler appeared wiser than he had ever been. History has a remarkable ability to improve reputations after the fact. Let's gently sail toward the Pacific, toward a queen rather than a king, because defeated monarchs were not always men. One of the most compelling examples is Queen Lilitububuokea of Hawaii. By the late 19th century, Hawaii faced growing foreign influence. Political pressure increased. Economic interests expanded. Power gradually shifted away from the native monarchy. Eventually, Queen Lilitububuokea was overthrown. Her kingdom disappeared. A monarchy that had governed the islands for generations came to an end. Unlike many rulers in history, she responded with remarkable dignity. She avoided encouraging widespread violence. She sought justice through political means. She wrote books, composed music, documented her experiences and preserved the memory of her people. There is a quiet strength in that response. Not every defeated ruler spent years plotting revenge. Some focused on preserving culture, identity, history. Their legacy became something larger than a throne, and in many ways, those achievements endured longer than kingdoms themselves. Let's float back to Europe once more, because Europe never seemed to run out of displaced royalty. By the 19th century, the continent contained an astonishing number of former kings, former princes, former claimants, and former dynasties. Political change moved quickly, nationalism grew stronger, empires shifted, revolutions erupted. The old order began cracking. Many royal families suddenly discovered that crowns came with expiration dates. Some adapted surprisingly well, others did not. One amusing detail appears repeatedly in historical records. Former monarchs often remained obsessed with protocol. Titles still mattered, ceremonies still mattered, seating arrangements still mattered, even after losing everything. Imagine a gathering of exiled royals. Nobody has a kingdom, nobody commands armies, nobody controls governments, yet everyone is arguing about who enters the room first. History contains numerous examples of exactly this behavior. Human beings are wonderfully consistent. Even stripped of power, they carry old habits with them. A king who spent 40 years expecting people to bow does not suddenly become casual. The throne may disappear, the mindset remains, and perhaps that is one of the most interesting lessons from all these stories. Losing a kingdom did not automatically transform a person. The same hopes remained, the same fears, the same pride, the same insecurities. Kings turned out to be remarkably human once the crown was removed, sometimes disappointingly human, sometimes surprisingly human. But human nonetheless. As the night deepens and our journey continues, we are approaching some of history's most dramatic royal endings. Monarchs who spent decades in exile, rulers who outlived their kingdoms by half a century, and former sovereigns who discovered that ordinary life could be stranger than any royal court. So settle in a little deeper, adjust the blanket, and prepare for another slow wander through the curious world of kings who lost everything. Because for many of them, the most interesting chapter began after the kingdom was gone. The night is growing wonderfully quiet now. The castles we have visited are fading into darkness. The battlefields have disappeared beneath centuries of grass. The banners have long since crumbled into dust. And yet somewhere in the shadows of history, former kings are still wandering through our story. Some are hopeful, some are bitter, some are surprisingly peaceful. And a few are still absolutely convinced that next year will be the year they finally get their throne back. History suggests otherwise, but optimism can be a very stubborn thing, especially among royalty. Let's gently continue our journey. One fascinating reality about defeated monarchs is that many ended up living longer after losing power than they ever did while ruling. Their reigns might last 10 years, 15 years, sometimes only months, yet exile could stretch on for decades. In other words, the majority of their lives was spent not as kings, but as former kings. That creates a strange problem. How do you explain yourself? Imagine introducing yourself at a dinner party. Hello, I used to rule an entire kingdom. People would probably have questions. Former monarchs often became trapped between identities, too royal to be ordinary, too powerless to be rulers. A peculiar middle ground. Let's drift toward one of history's most remarkable examples. King Michael of Romania. Unlike many figures we've discussed tonight, Michael lived well into the modern era. He experienced World War I, the Cold War, the fall of communism, and the arrival of the internet, which means he went from horseback ceremonies to email, quite a journey. Michael became king while still young. His reign unfolded during one of the most chaotic periods imaginable. War swept across Europe, political alliances shifted constantly, governments collapsed, empires vanished. It was not an easy time to be anyone, particularly a king. Eventually, communist authorities forced him to abdicate just like that. A monarchy that had existed for generations ended. Michael left Romania. His kingdom disappeared. His crown became history. and yet he still had decades of life ahead of him. Decades. Many former monarchs faced this challenge. They expected to spend their entire lives ruling. Instead, they found themselves building entirely new lives. Michael worked ordinary jobs. At various points, he worked as a pilot. He engaged in business. He lived outside the spotlight. Imagine the adjustment. One decade you're conducting state ceremonies, the next you're trying to earn a living. History rarely prepares kings for such transitions, yet Michael adapted remarkably well, perhaps because he understood something many rulers never did. Life continues, titles come and go, kingdoms rise and fall, but people remain people, and sometimes ordinary dignity survives where royal power does not. Let's float toward another fascinating case. The last king of Italy, Umberto II. Now, poor Umberto had perhaps one of the shortest royal careers imaginable. He became king in 1946, then, only weeks later, Italy voted to abolish the monarchy. Imagine finally receiving your dream job, then discovering it ends a month later. Not ideal. Italy became a republic, the royal family departed, and Umberto spent the rest of his life in exile. What makes his story interesting is the sheer length of that exile. Decades passed, governments changed, entire generations grew up, the world transformed. Yet Umberto never returned permanently. His kingdom existed only in memory. By the time he died, most Italians had never lived under a king at all. The monarchy had become something from history books. This happened repeatedly throughout the 20th century. Kings outlived the systems that created them. They became living relics, human reminders of vanished worlds, and that can be a lonely position. Let's slowly wander into another recurring theme. The defeated king who simply refuses to move on. History offers countless examples. One particularly striking case involves the Jacobite claimants. Generation after generation spent decades pursuing lost crowns. The original kingdom vanished further into the past. Supporters dwindled, opportunities disappeared. Yet the dream survived. Families passed it down like an heirloom. A throne that no longer existed remained the center of their identity. There's something almost touching about it. And something slightly tragic. Entire lives built around restoration. Entire careers devoted to impossible returns. Entire futures sacrificed to yesterday. Human beings often struggle to let go. Former kings were no exception. If anything, they may have struggled more than most. After all, they had lost something enormous. Not merely wealth, not merely status, but purpose. Let's float toward a quieter example, because not every defeated ruler spent decades plotting revenge. Some discovered unexpected peace. One of the most remarkable examples comes from Bulgaria. Tsar Simeon II lost his throne as a child. His monarchy disappeared after World War II. Like many royal families, he entered exile. The story could have ended there. Instead, something extraordinary happened. Decades later, Simeon returned to Bulgaria, not as king, not as claimant, not as revolutionary. He returned as a politician. Eventually, he even became prime minister. Think about that for a moment. A former king returning through democratic elections. History rarely writes scripts like that. The irony is almost perfect. He lost the crown, then gained power through an entirely different system. No invasion, no uprising, no restoration, just elections. It is one of the strangest and most peaceful royal afterlives ever recorded, and it demonstrates how dramatically the modern world changed the fate of defeated monarchs. In earlier centuries, losing a kingdom often meant prison or permanent exile. By the 20th century, other possibilities existed, not always, but sometimes. Let's drift back into the deeper past for a moment, because some kings faced a much harsher reality. Not all defeated rulers received comfortable exile. Not all received elegant villas. Not all enjoyed peaceful retirement. Many simply vanished. A medieval ruler might disappear into captivity and leave behind only scattered references. A brief mention in a chronicle, a note in a monastery record, a few surviving letters, then silence. History remembers famous kings, but countless defeated rulers faded almost completely from memory. Their kingdoms disappeared, their descendants scattered, their stories dissolved into the background. There is something hauntingly quiet about that. A man once commanded armies, issued laws, held audiences, influenced thousands of lives. Then centuries later, only a few sentences remain. Perhaps that is why historians find defeated monarchs so fascinating. Victory tends to preserve itself, defeat often disappears, and every surviving story feels precious. As our sleepy journey continues, another question begins emerging. What was actually worse, losing a kingdom or watching somebody else rule it? Many former kings spent years observing successors occupy their former palaces, sit on their former thrones, command their former subjects. That must have been difficult, to put it mildly. Imagine spending years building a career, then watching somebody else inherit everything. Now multiply that feeling by an entire kingdom. Some monarchs became consumed by resentment, others learned acceptance. A few even developed friendships with former rivals. History occasionally surprises us. Not every ending was bitter. Not every defeat led to hatred. Sometimes age softened old conflicts. Time has a way of doing that. Eventually, even kings grow tired. Even exiles grow accustomed to new homes. Even dreams fade. And sometimes a former monarch discovers something unexpected. A life beyond the throne, a quieter existence, a smaller world, perhaps a happier one, not always, but sometimes. And as we move deeper into the night, we will soon meet rulers who spent half a century longing for vanished kingdoms, monarchs who became symbols for lost nations, and a few extraordinary figures who managed to reinvent themselves after losing everything. For now, though, let the castles grow distant, let the crowns fade into shadow, and let the former kings continue their slow walk through history. The night has settled comfortably around us now. The world outside is quiet. The castles in our story have become distant silhouettes against the moonlight, and somewhere, deep within the pages of history, another former king is waking up in exile and remembering that he used to own half the country, which must have been a strange thought to carry around every morning, especially after 20 years, or 30, or 50. One of the curious things about monarchy is that it trains people to think in very long timelines. Kings expected their dynasties to continue forever. Their children would inherit, then grandchildren, then great-grandchildren. The family throne was supposed to stretch endlessly into the future. Reality, unfortunately, was often much shorter. A dynasty could vanish in a generation. A kingdom could disappear in a decade. A crown could become a museum piece before its owner reached old age. And few stories demonstrate this better than the tale of King Constantine II of Greece. Now Constantine's story belongs to the modern world. Cars existed. Television existed. Airplanes existed, which somehow makes royal exile feel even stranger. In earlier centuries, losing a kingdom often meant disappearing into some distant castle where communication traveled at the speed of a horse. Modern monarchs faced a different challenge. They could watch events unfold in real time. Every news report, every election, every political development. Their former kingdoms remained visible, always just out of reach. Constantine became king in 1964. At first, everything appeared reasonably stable. Then politics intervened. As politics tends to do, conflicts emerged between the monarchy and the government. Military officers became involved. Tensions escalated. Before long, Constantine found himself leaving Greece. And like so many monarchs before him, he expected the exile to be temporary. Most exiles begin that way. Nobody packs for permanent defeat. Nobody leaves a palace thinking, well, I suppose I'll never live here again. Instead, they imagine a quick return, a few months, perhaps a year, then everything will be sorted out. History repeatedly demonstrates otherwise. Years passed, then decades. The monarchy was abolished. Generations grew up without a king, and Constantine remained abroad. A familiar pattern, the throne vanished. The title lingered. The memories remained. One can only imagine how surreal it must have felt. To open a newspaper and see discussions about your former kingdom, your former palace, your former position, all while living somewhere else entirely. History contains many tragedies. Some are loud, some are violent, others are quiet. The slow realization that an old life is never coming back may be one of the quietest. Let's drift toward another curious phenomenon. Former kings often became collectors, not kingdoms. Those were harder to acquire: objects, memories, photographs, letters, documents. Anything connected to their lost world. And in a way, this makes perfect sense. A kingdom is an enormous thing to lose. People naturally cling to whatever pieces remain. Some exiled royals filled houses with portraits of ancestors, family heirlooms, old uniforms, royal gifts. Entire rooms became miniature museums dedicated to vanished dynasties. Visitors sometimes described these homes as frozen in time, as though the monarchy still existed inside the walls, even when it no longer existed anywhere else. There is something deeply human about that. Most people preserve memories after major life changes. Former kings simply did it on a slightly larger scale, sometimes involving crowns and ceremonial swords, and portraits larger than dining room tables. Because if you're going to be nostalgic, you might as well commit fully. Let's gently float toward one of the saddest royal stories of the 20th century, King Farouk of Egypt. Farouk became king while still young. He inherited enormous wealth, great prestige, a famous dynasty, all the symbols of royal success. For a while, life seemed comfortable, perhaps too comfortable. Farouk developed a reputation for luxury, expensive tastes, lavish spending, and an enthusiasm for collecting things, particularly cars, which, admittedly, is a hobby shared by many people. The difference was scale. Farouk collected automobiles the way some people collect postcards. His lifestyle became legendary. Unfortunately, public opinion became less enthusiastic. Political problems multiplied, national tensions increased. Eventually, military officers overthrew the monarchy. Farouk abdicated, and just like that, the King of Egypt became another royal exile. He settled in Italy, far from Cairo, far from the palaces, far from the kingdom that had defined his identity. Observers noted that he struggled with the transition. Many defeated rulers did. After all, exile often involved a strange contradiction. Former kings remained famous. People recognized them, newspapers discussed them, yet they possessed very little actual influence. Visibility without power, recognition without authority, a curious combination. Farouk spent his remaining years living abroad, watching history move forward without him. And perhaps that is one of the most difficult experiences for any former ruler, the realization that the world continues perfectly well without your leadership. Kings rarely receive that lesson during their reigns. History provides it afterward. Let's float gently toward another recurring theme, the children of defeated kings. Because exile did not affect only monarchs themselves. Entire families lived with the consequences. Imagine being born after the kingdom was lost. Your father is a king, sort of. Your family possesses royal titles, sort of. People treat you like royalty, sort of. Everything becomes complicated. Many royal children grew up surrounded by stories of places they had never seen, palaces they had never visited, kingdoms they had never ruled. Yet these places remained central to family identity. A child might spend decades hearing about the homeland, the throne, the dynasty, the glorious past, and yet know all of it only through stories. History produced entire generations of such royal exiles, children raised on memory, children inheriting claims instead of kingdoms, children learning that their future depended on events that happened long before they were born. It was not always an easy inheritance. Sometimes it became a burden. Let's drift briefly into one of history's more unusual outcomes. Occasionally, a defeated king became more popular after losing power than before. Strange, but true. Distance has a way of improving reputations. People forget flaws, mistakes become smaller. Nostalgia works its magic. Soon enough, the former ruler begins looking better than the current one. This happened repeatedly across Europe. And not just Europe, former monarchs transformed into symbols, representations of stability, tradition, national identity. Whether they deserved those reputations is another question entirely. History often edits memories. The result can be surprisingly flattering. Mediocre king may become a beloved exile. An unpopular monarch may become a national icon. Human beings are remarkably creative when remembering the past. Let's settle for a moment beside a simple observation. Not every king was suited for power. In fact, quite a few seem to have been actively unsuited for it. Some were happier after losing their kingdoms, though they rarely admitted it. The constant pressure disappeared. The endless ceremonies vanished. Political crises became someone else's problem. There is a certain freedom in that. Imagine spending 40 years solving national emergencies. Then suddenly the emergencies belong to somebody else. Perhaps that sounds disappointing, or perhaps it sounds like retirement. A few former monarchs quietly embraced ordinary life. They pursued hobbies, raised families, read books, went for walks, managed estates, and discovered that existence could be pleasant even without a crown. History doesn't always focus on these quieter endings, but they matter. Because they remind us that kings were people first, monarchs second, and once the throne disappeared, the person remained. As our journey continues deeper into the night, we are approaching the final generations of Europe's great royal exiles, the last kings who watched ancient monarchies disappear, the last rulers who carried centuries of dynastic history into a rapidly changing modern world. And some of their stories are surprisingly peaceful, others are surprisingly lonely. But all of them reveal something fascinating about power. Eventually, every throne becomes a chair, every crown becomes an object, and every king becomes a person. The kingdom may vanish, the title may fade, but life continues quietly, steadily, one ordinary day after another. And for defeated kings, that ordinary life was often the strangest adventure of all. The night is deep now. Most of the kingdoms we have visited no longer exist. Many of their castles stand silent. Some have become museums. Others are ruins. A few have vanished completely beneath modern cities. And yet the former kings remain with us, still wandering through history, still carrying titles that no longer rule anything, still holding memories of worlds that disappeared long ago. There is something strangely peaceful about that. History often feels obsessed with beginnings, the rise of empires, the founding of dynasties, the victories, the coronations, the grand entrances. But tonight we are exploring endings, and endings are usually quieter. The kingdom rarely disappears all at once. Instead, it slowly drifts away, like a ship vanishing into fog. At first, everyone notices, then fewer people do. Eventually, only historians remember exactly where it went. Let's continue with one of the most remarkable features of defeated monarchs, their ability to remain hopeful long after logic had abandoned the conversation. Many exiled kings spent decades believing restoration was just around the corner, not next century, not eventually. Soon, always soon. The problem was that soon kept moving. 5 years became 10, 10 became 20, 20 became 40. Yet somehow the dream survived. One of the best examples comes from the Bourbon family of France. After the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon, members of the royal family spent years in exile. Then, rather unexpectedly, they returned. For a while, then they lost power again, then returned again, then lost it again. French politics during the 19th century occasionally resembled a revolving door attached to a throne. Kings came back, kings left, empires appeared, republics emerged, then disappeared, then reappeared. At times, even the French seemed unsure who was supposed to be in charge. For exiled monarchs elsewhere in Europe, these events created a dangerous emotion, hope, because every successful restoration suggested that their own return might be possible, maybe next year, maybe after the next war, maybe after the next election, maybe after the next crisis. History became a long sequence of maybes, and many former kings built entire lives around those maybes. Let's gently float toward one of the strangest realities of exile: money, because contrary to popular imagination, not every former king remained wealthy. Some certainly did. Others discovered that losing a kingdom could be surprisingly expensive. Palaces required maintenance, staff required payment, travel cost money. Lifestyles developed during monarchy were not always easy to support afterward. Imagine spending 40 years living as a king, then receiving a budget, not ideal. A number of royal families quietly sold jewelry, paintings, properties, heirlooms, sometimes entire collections accumulated over centuries. A crown may symbolize power, but unfortunately it does not automatically pay utility bills. History rarely focuses on these practical details, yet they mattered enormously. Former kings still needed food. Housing, income, the ordinary requirements of life. Many adapted, some struggled. A few became surprisingly skilled businessmen, others did not. One suspect's centuries of royal education had not included many lessons on balancing accounts. Let's drift toward another fascinating theme, the friendships formed among exiled monarchs. Because exile could be a lonely experience, very few people understood it. Most individuals never lose kingdoms, statistically speaking. So former rulers often found companionship among others who shared similar experiences. European royal families became interconnected networks. Former kings visited former kings. Former queens wrote letters to former queens. Displaced dynasties attended weddings, funerals, and family gatherings. Occasionally, these events looked remarkably grand. An observer might see elegant uniforms, decorations, titles, ceremonies, everything associated with monarchy. The only missing ingredient was an actual kingdom, which must have produced some unusual conversations. Imagine a room filled with people who all used to rule countries. History likely missed some excellent dinner table discussions. Let's gently sail into one of the more emotional aspects of royal defeat, returning home, because not every exile remained permanent. Some monarchs eventually revisited the lands they once ruled, and these visits could be surprisingly moving. Imagine leaving a country as a young ruler, then returning 50 years later. Entire cities have changed, generations have passed, old supporters are gone, new citizens barely recognize your name. The homeland remains familiar and unfamiliar. At the same time, many former monarchs described these journeys with mixed emotions: pride, sadness, nostalgia, curiosity, a sense of belonging, and a sense of distance. Home remained home, yet it no longer belonged to them. Perhaps it never truly had. That realization appears repeatedly in memoirs written by exiled royals. The kingdom survives, the people continue, life moves forward. The throne was only one chapter in a much larger story, and that can be a difficult lesson for anyone who spent decades at the center of national life. Let's float briefly toward another recurring pattern. Former kings often became historians, not professional historians necessarily, but storytellers, memoir writers, collectors of memories, guardians of family traditions. Many devoted enormous effort to preserving the past, perhaps because they understood how quickly it could disappear. A kingdom may fall in a year, a dynasty may collapse in a month, but stories can survive much longer. Some of our knowledge about vanished monarchies exists because defeated rulers carefully documented their experiences, their victories, their mistakes, their disappointments, their hopes, even their complaints. And former kings were often very talented complainers. Centuries of royal confidence did not vanish overnight. Memoirs written by exiled monarchs occasionally contain enough grievances to power a small city. Yet beneath the frustration lies something valuable, a human perspective, not the view from a battlefield, not the view from a government archive, the view from the throne itself, or more accurately, from the person who no longer occupied it. Let's settle for a moment beside one final observation. Most kings spent their entire lives preparing to rule. Very few prepared to lose, and yet losing may have revealed more about them than ruling ever did. Power can hide character, success can disguise weaknesses, a throne creates distance. But defeat strips many of those things away. Once the kingdom disappears, what remains? Some former monarchs became bitter, others became wise, some remained stubborn until the end, others discovered humility. A few found happiness in unexpected places: gardens, books, family life, religion, travel, simple routines. The things ordinary people often take for granted. And perhaps that is one of the most surprising conclusions of our journey. For all their crowns and ceremonies, kings were never entirely different from everyone else. They feared losing what they loved. They struggled with change. They clung to memories. They hoped for second chances. And eventually they had to make peace with time, just like the rest of us. As the night continues and our long walk through royal defeat approaches its final chapters, We'll soon meet the last great exiles of the 20th century and explore what became of monarchy itself in a world that increasingly moved beyond kings. Because the story is no longer just about defeated rulers, it's about the end of entire royal worlds. And that, as we'll discover next, is a quieter story than most people imagine. The night is very quiet now. The candles in our imaginary castles have almost burned down, the royal courts have emptied, the musicians have packed away their instruments, the servants have gone to sleep, and somewhere, in a comfortable chair beside a window, an old former king is staring into the darkness and remembering a world that no longer exists. That image appears again and again throughout history, an aging monarch, a vanished kingdom, a lifetime of memories, and a future that turned out very differently from what anyone expected. As we continue our slow journey, we arrive at one of the strangest chapters in the story of defeated kings, the 20th century, because for centuries monarchy seemed permanent, not invincible, but permanent. Kingdoms rose and fell, certainly, dynasties came and went, but the institution itself survived. There was always another king somewhere, another prince, another emperor, another royal family preparing the next generation. Then the modern world arrived. And suddenly thrones began disappearing at an astonishing speed. Empires collapsed, revolutions spread, world wars reshaped continents, governments changed, old systems vanished. For the first time in centuries, many royal families found themselves asking the same uncomfortable question: what exactly comes after monarchy? And nobody really had an answer. Let's gently drift toward Austria, home of the Habsburgs, the dynasty that spent centuries mastering the art of royal marriage. Sometimes perhaps a little too enthusiastically. The Habsburg family ruled vast territories for generations. Emperors came and went. Palaces expanded, ceremonies multiplied. Entire governments revolved around their authority. Then World War I arrived. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed. The monarchy ended. And just like that, one of Europe's oldest ruling families became a former ruling family, a remarkable transformation. For centuries, the Habsburgs had occupied the center of European politics. Now they were private citizens, private citizens with exceptionally impressive family trees, but private citizens nonetheless. One of the most fascinating figures to emerge from this transition was Otto von Habsburg. He was born into a world that assumed he would one day become emperor. His education reflected that expectation. His upbringing reflected that expectation. His entire future reflected that expectation. Then the empire disappeared. Imagine training for a single profession your entire life, then discovering the profession itself no longer exists. That was Otto's situation. Yet unlike many royal claimants throughout history, he adapted remarkably well. Rather than spending his life obsessing over restoration, he embraced new roles: politics, public service, European cooperation, modern diplomacy. The crown never returned, but life continued. And perhaps Otto understood something that many former monarchs struggled to accept. History moves forward, not backward. Let's float gently toward another royal family that faced a similar challenge, the Romanovs of Russia. Now their story is often remembered for its tragedy, and understandably so. But what interests us tonight is something slightly different: the survivors, the relatives, the descendants, the people who spent decades living in a world without the empire that had defined their existence. For generations, the Romanovs ruled one of the largest empires on earth. Then suddenly they didn't. Exiled scattered family members across Europe. Former Grand Dukes became immigrants. Former aristocrats searched for employment. Former royals adjusted to ordinary life. The transition was not always easy. Many had never expected to support themselves. Some adapted successfully, others struggled. A few discovered talents nobody knew they possessed. History contains countless examples of former nobles becoming artists, writers, business owners, and teachers. Necessity can be surprisingly educational. Let's drift toward another curious phenomenon: the tourist king. Because eventually many former royal residences became tourist attractions. Palaces transformed into museums. Royal apartments became exhibits. Visitors wandered through rooms once occupied by monarchs, and occasionally former kings themselves visited. Imagine that experience. Walking through your childhood home, except your childhood home is now a national museum. People are buying tickets to see it. Guides are explaining your family history, children are taking photographs, and gift shops are selling souvenirs. History has a wonderfully strange sense of humor sometimes. Many former monarchs handled these situations gracefully, others found them difficult, understandably so. After all, a palace is not merely a building, it is a collection of memories, a place where people lived. Celebrated, argued, worked, dreamed. Losing a kingdom often meant losing those places too. Let's settle into one of the deeper themes running beneath all these stories. Identity, because if a king is no longer a king, who is he? That question haunted many former monarchs, and not just monarchs. Anyone who loses a defining role eventually faces something similar. Athletes retire, military officers leave service, executives step away from careers, people change, life changes. The challenge becomes building a new identity. Former kings simply experienced that challenge on an unusually dramatic scale. Some embraced it, others resisted. A few never stopped introducing themselves primarily through the crown they had lost. And perhaps that is understandable. For decades, sometimes entire lifetimes, monarchy shaped every aspect of their existence. Letting go was never going to be easy. Let's float softly toward one final royal habit, memory. Former kings remembered everything, the ceremonies, the uniforms, the coronations. The palaces, the political battles, the victories, the mistakes. As they aged, many became living archives, walking collections of stories, witnesses to vanished worlds. And there is something quietly valuable about that, because kingdoms disappear, buildings crumble, documents fade, but personal memories preserve details that official records often miss. The sound of a crowded court, the feeling of wearing a crown for the first time, the awkward conversation before a diplomatic crisis. The private worries hidden behind public confidence. These details survive because people remembered them, and many former monarchs spent their final years sharing those memories, perhaps because they understood that someone should. As our journey moves closer to its conclusion, we begin seeing a larger picture. Defeated kings were not merely political figures, they were people experiencing loss, adjustment, change, and uncertainty, the same challenges faced by everyone else, only on a much larger stage. Some handled it well, some handled it badly, most landed somewhere in between, which is probably the most human outcome possible. The crowns disappeared, the kingdoms vanished, but the people remained, trying to make sense of a world that had changed around them. And in our next part, we'll move toward the final reflections of this long, sleepy journey through royal defeat. We'll see what these stories reveal about power itself, and why the lives of former kings may actually be more interesting than the reigns they left behind. The night is at its deepest now. The great kingdoms of our story have faded into the darkness. The banners have stopped fluttering. The court musicians have long since gone home. The palace corridors are empty. And if we listen closely, we can almost hear the footsteps of countless former kings echoing through history, not marching toward victory. Not riding into battle, simply walking one day at a time. And perhaps that is the most surprising thing we have discovered tonight. Most kings expected history to remember them for how they ruled. Instead, many became fascinating because of how they lost. Because defeat reveals things that victory often hides. A successful ruler can appear larger than life. A defeated ruler becomes unmistakably human. Let's spend a little more time wandering through these quiet afterlives. Because there is one question that follows nearly every fallen monarch. Did they regret it? Did they look back and wish they had acted differently, chosen another path, fought another battle, trusted different advisors? History rarely gives us perfect answers, but their letters sometimes do, their memoirs, their private conversations, their reflections late in life. Many former kings spent years revisiting old decisions, again and again. A battle lost decades earlier, a treaty signed in haste. A trusted ally who turned out not to be trustworthy, a rebellion ignored until it was too late. The human mind loves revisiting crossroads. Former kings were no exception. In fact, they may have been worse than most. After all, when an ordinary person makes a mistake, the consequences are usually limited. When a monarch makes a mistake, an entire kingdom may feel it. That is a heavy memory to carry, and many carried it for the rest of their lives. Let's gently drift toward another truth. Some defeated rulers became unexpectedly wise. Not all, certainly not all. History contains plenty of stubborn former monarchs who spent 50 years insisting that absolutely nothing had been their fault. Human nature remains consistent. Yet others gained a perspective they never possessed while on the throne. Power creates distance. People tell kings what they want to hear. Failures are hidden. Criticism is softened. Reality becomes filtered. Defeat removes many of those filters. Suddenly, the former ruler sees the world differently. Sometimes, for the first time, several exiled monarchs later admitted mistakes, recognized failures, acknowledged weaknesses. The throne had prevented that kind of honesty. Losing it made honesty unavoidable. And perhaps that is one of history's quieter ironies. A few kings learned more about leadership after losing power than they ever did while possessing it. Let's float slowly toward another recurring theme, time, because time eventually defeats everyone. The conqueror, the rebel, the emperor, the king, all of them. At first, former monarchs often measured life according to politics. The next election, the next crisis, the next opportunity for restoration, the next chance to return. Then years passed. Children grew up, grandchildren arrived, old supporters died, new generations emerged. Gradually, the future began looking different. Many exiled rulers eventually stopped dreaming about recovery, not because they gave up, but because life itself changed. A man who spends 30 years in exile is no longer the same person who left. The homeland changes, the exile changes. Even if the throne somehow returns, the past never does. And that realization appears again and again in royal memoirs. The kingdom they wanted back existed mostly in memory, not reality. Let's wander toward one final royal gathering. Imagine a room somewhere in Europe during the 20th century. Several former kings are present. A few former queens, princes, princesses. Claimants, exiles, children of vanished dynasties. The room is filled with remarkable stories. One person used to rule a kingdom that no longer exists. Another once lived in a palace that is now a museum. A third spent decades hoping for restoration. A fourth quietly built a new life and moved on. Different experiences, different personalities, yet all connected by a common reality. History changed around them, and they had to adapt or fail to adapt, just like everyone else. The scale was larger, the titles were grander, the uniforms were certainly more elaborate, but the challenge itself was familiar. Change arrives, and people respond. That has always been the human story. Kings merely experienced it under brighter lights. Let's settle for a moment beside one of the gentlest lessons hidden within all these tales. Power is temporary. It always has been. The largest empire eventually shrinks. The strongest dynasty eventually weakens. The grandest palace eventually requires a tour guide. History demonstrates this with remarkable consistency. Yet generation after generation believed their own kingdom would be different, permanent, enduring, special. History smiled politely, then continued doing what history does. Empires rose, empires fell, new rulers arrived, old rulers departed. The cycle continued. And somewhere, another former king began writing memoirs. Perhaps that sounds sad. In some ways it is. But there is also something comforting about it. Because if power is temporary, then failure is temporary too. The crown disappears, the throne vanishes, life continues. Again and again, we have seen defeated monarchs build unexpected second lives. Some became writers, some became travelers, some became politicians, some became gardeners. History contains a surprising number of royal gardeners. Apparently, tending roses is a popular activity once ruling nations is no longer available. Honestly, it sounds considerably less stressful. Let's gently float toward the final decades of these royal lives. Many former kings died far from the places they once ruled. Others eventually returned. Some were buried in their homeland. Others remained in exile even after death. Yet almost all shared one final experience. They became history. The political struggles that once consumed them faded. The crises seemed smaller. The controversies softened. Future generations remembered only fragments. Portrait, a photograph, a few stories, perhaps a statue, perhaps a museum display, perhaps nothing at all. And that may be the ultimate fate of every ruler, not domination, not glory, memory, a surprisingly fragile thing. As we approach the final part of our journey, the kingdoms are nearly out of sight. The crowns are gathering dust. The former kings are growing old. And history itself seems to be settling down for the night. But before we finish, there is one last chapter waiting for us. Quiet reflection on why the defeated kings of history remain so fascinating, and what their stories reveal about ambition, identity, and the strange experience of losing everything you once believed would last forever. The night is almost over now. The fire has burned down to glowing embers. The castles we've visited are fading into the darkness. The kingdoms are becoming distant memories, and the former kings who have accompanied us through this long journey are settling into the final pages of their stories. If you've been drifting along with me for the past several hours, wrapped in blankets while wandering through centuries of royal disappointment, political disasters, awkward exiles, and surprisingly emotional retirements, you've probably noticed something. The most interesting part of many kings' lives was not when they ruled, it was what happened afterward. Because history usually teaches us about power, tonight, we've been learning about its absence, and those are not quite the same thing. When a king sits on a throne, surrounded by servants, advisors, soldiers, and ceremony, it can be difficult to see the person beneath the crown. The position overwhelms everything else. The title becomes the identity. The institution becomes the individual. But when the throne disappears, something interesting happens. The person remains. And sometimes that person turns out to be far more fascinating than the ruler ever was. Let's spend a little time reflecting on that. Because after meeting all these defeated monarchs, a pattern begins to emerge. Again and again, we saw people who believed they were preparing for one life, then ended up living another. A prince raised to inherit a kingdom becomes an exile. A king who expected to die on the throne spends 40 years abroad. An emperor becomes a citizen. A ruler becomes a writer. A claimant becomes a businessman. A royal child grows up in a country their ancestors never imagined. History is filled with these unexpected transformations, and perhaps that is why defeated kings feel strangely relatable. Most of us will never lose a kingdom. Statistically speaking, the odds remain low, but almost everyone experiences some version of the same thing. A dream changes, a plan fails, a future disappears. Life heads in a direction we never expected. And then comes the difficult question, what now? Former kings spent centuries wrestling with exactly that problem. Some handled it well. Others absolutely did not. History gives us examples of every possible reaction. There were rulers who adapted gracefully, rulers who remained trapped in bitterness, rulers who embraced ordinary life, rulers who spent decades staring backward, and rulers who never entirely accepted reality. Human nature in all its variety, just wearing slightly fancier clothing. Let's gently return to something we discussed earlier, the strange loneliness of former kings. Because monarchy creates a very unusual existence. From childhood, many rulers lived inside carefully controlled worlds. People bowed, doors opened, instructions were followed. Their opinions carried enormous weight. Their schedules shaped nations. Then suddenly none of that exists anymore. Imagine spending 50 years at the center of attention, then becoming an observer, not irrelevant, but no longer central. That transition must have felt enormous. And perhaps it explains why so many exiled monarchs became fascinated with memory. Memories offered continuity. The past remained a place where they still mattered, a place where the crown still existed, a place where the kingdom had not yet vanished. We all do this to some extent. We revisit old chapters, old homes, old friendships, old versions of ourselves. Former kings simply had larger chapters to revisit, sometimes involving palaces, sometimes involving entire nations. The emotional experience feels surprisingly familiar. Let's float softly toward one final irony. Many rulers spent their reigns trying desperately to control history. They issued laws, built monuments, married strategically, fought wars, founded dynasties, everything aimed at shaping the future. Yet once they lost power, they often discovered something remarkable. History cannot really be controlled, only influenced. And even that influence fades with time. A king may spend decades constructing a legacy. Future generations remember something entirely different. One ruler wants to be remembered as a military genius. History remembers his strange haircut. Another builds an empire. Future generations remember a scandal. A third spends years pursuing conquest. History remembers his pet animals. The past has a sense of humor, and historians occasionally help. Let's take one last slow walk through our gallery of defeated monarchs. The kings who wandered Europe searching for support. The rulers who stared across borders toward homelands they would never see again. The monarchs who transformed into tourists in former palaces. The claimants who inherited dreams instead of kingdoms. The emperors who became ordinary citizens. The queens who preserved culture after losing power. The exiles who never stopped hopping. The pragmatists who moved forward. The gardeners, the writers, the retirees, the nostalgics, the optimists, the complainers, especially the complainers. History has always had an abundant supply of those. And through all their differences, one thing connected them: loss, not necessarily physical loss, not always wealth, not always comfort, but identity, the loss of a role, the loss of a future they expected, the loss of certainty. And that experience is universal. Kings felt it, queens felt it, commoners felt it. People feel it today, which may explain why stories about defeated rulers continue to resonate centuries later. Because beneath the crowns and ceremonies, we recognize something familiar, a human being trying to adapt when life refuses to follow the script. And perhaps that is the true lesson hidden within all these royal afterlives. Not that power is fragile, though it is, not that kingdoms disappear, though they do, but that people are remarkably adaptable. Again and again, history presented former monarchs with impossible circumstances, and again, they found ways to continue, sometimes elegantly. Sometimes awkwardly, sometimes stubbornly, but they continued, life after the throne, life after defeat, life after the ending they never expected. As our journey finally reaches its conclusion, the former kings are disappearing into the darkness of history. The castles are quiet, the kingdoms are distant, the crowns rest behind museum glass, and somewhere, perhaps in an imaginary garden tended by retired monarchs from every century, a group of former kings is sitting together beneath the stars. No armies, no ceremonies, no political crises, no succession disputes, just old stories, old memories, and the shared understanding that every kingdom eventually belongs to the past. Thank you for joining me tonight on this long, sleepy wander through the strange lives of defeated kings. Rest well, and remember, history is full of winners, but sometimes the losers leave behind the most interesting stories.